All right, I need Linda or somebody to allow me to share my screen. Let's see.
Got it then?
Yes.
Great.
I got the power. All right. Okay, so I am charged with explaining the kind of big picture problem that is the impetus for this research. And kind of this narrative is something I think a lot of you are going to be familiar with. So I'm going to cover it really quickly. But we'll have a lot more time at the end of this meeting to kind of parse it out and ask questions and brainstorm a little bit. So the research problem for this project really comes down to the fact that we have a trend of low tree diversity in US cities, especially in highly built up areas. So areas where there's a lot of human influence in the ways of infrastructure, hardscapes, etc. And there are some recent studies to back this up. So for example, a study that came out in 2020 found that the average community in the US relies on about 6 species for most of its street trees. And then we have another study from the Northeast where the Acer genus, so our maples, accounted for almost 40% of all the trees that were inventoried. And we see this pattern over and over again when we look at urban tree inventory data, and especially down here in Florida, where we have an opportunity for a lot of diversity, we still tend to find a small amount of species dominating the built urban forest. And this is an issue because when you have low species diversity, your forests are vulnerable to a number of threats, and these include pests. So there are a lot of pests that attack at either the genus or family level. Examples would be emerald ash borer, Japanese beetle, Asian longhorn beetle. I'm sure you can think of some more. Diseases are another issue. So we have historical examples like Dutch elm disease, and then we have more modern examples like lethal bronzing and laurel wilt and other diseases. And then when you have low species diversity, you also have less resilience to abiotic stressors. And the big one would be climate change. And so the more diversity you have, but diversity at different levels, then the greater the chance that you have some species in your forest that are going to survive some of these disasters that are happening and bound to continue to happen. The classic example that many of you on this call have probably experienced personally would be emerald ash borer. So a lot of temperate North American cities were replanted with ash trees after Dutch elm disease wiped out the elm trees. And then emerald ash borer came in and it's caused a significant amount of damage, at this point totaling in the billions, and the amount that it has cost municipalities. So it's a real economic threat in addition to being an ecological threat and a socio-ecological threat. Now, diversity itself is limited by a really complex mix of factors. These include biological, social, and economic factors. And we have this concept or framework to help make sense of this problem. And what you're seeing here is this, we call it the funnel, the diversity funnel. So we can start with a pretty large diversity of trees in the wild to choose from. But then once these trees are selected down based on biological limitations, production limitations, urban site limitations, which there are a lot of those, and then adoption limitations. So what is limiting the folks in the cities from actually planting these trees? And we end up with a really narrow selection or a limited pool of trees. And it's complex, like I said. So at each of these stages, there are tons and tons of factors that are going in and causing this funneling effect. And this is really what we're trying to get at. This is why we're doing a planning project like this with a huge multidisciplinary team, is because it's a really huge complex problem. In addition to having all those different factors, there are also a lot of different human actors or stakeholders who are making decisions that are ultimately affecting the diversity that we see in the urban environment. So, for example, we have researchers and horticulturalists, growers, which are huge, a huge stakeholder in this process. And then we move on to the folks who are making decisions about the design of cities as well as what gets planted in cities. And so that's actually a pretty large group of people. It includes policymakers, planners, extension and technical support, developers, landscape consultants, etc. And then there's another group of people that sometimes gets mixed up with the group above, depending on the situation. But this includes the people who are actually putting the trees in the ground. And all of these decisions, again, create that limited pool. But then there's also a really complex feedback loop that's happening, because a lot of times the folks who are making the purchasing and planting decisions are limited by availability. And so when they're just planting the species that they can find, then they're sending a feedback signal to the growers saying, this is the tree we want. And so the growers don't always hear that the purchasers want more diversity, if they do. Not all of them do, because not all of them know about it, about this issue. But this does happen, and there's some evidence of this in different surveys of practitioners that have been done around the country, where folks at the bottom would love to plant more, but in the end, they just plant what is available. So where we're at now is we have to employ a systems-based approach to identify the limitations and also outline the potential solutions. That's really the only way we're going to be able to tackle such a huge problem like this. And it's something that has been brought up by folks over and over again. I've noticed when I talk to stakeholders from around the country, a lot of them say, oh yeah, I talk about this all the time with my coworkers about how we need more diversity, or I want to find the species, but I can't. So clearly this exists, this problem exists, and people are aware of it, but it's getting at that really complex system of actors and decisions, and also approaching that feedback loop to really understand how we can kind of hack this and start adding in some more diversity to our forest. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that approach later on, but I'm going to hand it back over for now, over to Grant.